The first two have been recorded and are available on the website, right, on the website. And this one will be as well after the fact. Thank you, Claire, for the technology expertise that keeps us going here and enables these hybrid events. Yeah, big.
If you knew what's happened in the last 20 minutes. Raucous applause.
Yeah, it's all Claire. And just a big thank you to all of you for attending and for supporting Monhegan Associates. We are taking donations over here. Monhegan Associates, in addition to this, we're maintaining the trails and the wildlands on this island, and that everybody is loving and enjoying. So help us out if you can. If you're at home and you want to donate, you can go to the website and donate online. We are a nonprofit and we are supported by donations. Have I said that? Everybody get it? All right, so everybody at home should be muted at this point. Muting a couple people who are not. Okay. So just want to introduce Doug here. Doug is a Maine native. He grew up in Hollis. Some of you may know his dad, who lives out here, Paul. Hi, Paul. Doug went to the University of Maine, graduated in 2011. And throughout college, he worked at the Scarborough Marsh Audubon Center and got hooked. And in 2013, he became the staff naturalist at Maine Audubon in Falmouth. He was also the outreach coordinator for the Maine Bird Atlas, which ran from 2018 to 2022. So a lot of publicity and coordinating involved in that. And very soon we're going to know in-depth details about the birds that are living and breeding in Maine. In his free time, Doug volunteers as one of Maine's eBird reviewers, and he's moderator of the Maine's Birding Listserv and the Rare Bird Group Me. If any of you are birders and want to chase rare birds and are on Group Me, there is a Maine Rare Bird group. Doug is also on the York County Audubon Board and is a voting member of the Maine Bird Records Committee. He's going to talk to us about sort of the future, looking ahead at the future of birds on Monhegan, and it should be great. And these are all your photos, right? I mean, Doug is a great photographer, and most of these, if not all of these, are his amazing photos. So thank you. Let's welcome Doug.
Yeah. Just gonna clear these real quick. I think there's one photo that's not mine, but I put credit in. You'll know it when we get to it. Let me just move around some windows here. And I've got I was always taught, I remember taking public speaking up at Orono, and they said about 1 minute per slide is a good way to time yourselves. We're already 7:39. I don't want you to just listen to me like ramble on for an hour. So if we can like save questions for the end. That said, I've got 52 slides here. So let's dive into it. Try to keep on schedule. I will, and with that in mind, for our virtual audience, if you guys are having any problems hearing or anything, maybe definitely let us know in the chat. But if it seems like I'm ignoring you, maybe that's why. Sorry, we just had the most amazing dinner, I want to say. If you haven't been to the Monhegan house lately, except now my insulin pump is mad about something. So that cannoli was a great choice in the moment. Pardon me. So I think I'm contractually obligated to always start with this slide. So I work for Maine Audubon. It's an environmental nonprofit here in the state of Maine. We are independent from National Audubon, but do collaborate with them on a lot of projects. So what Maine Audubon does is, with our mission up here, we work to conserve Maine's wildlife and wildlife habitat. And I like to always kind of make that emphasis because I'll be focusing a lot on birds. Of course, that's kind of my background, my interest. But Maine Audubon kind of really has such a larger reach than that with a lot of the things we do. I like to say, like a tripod, the most sturdy object, Maine Audubon stands on these three legs of education, conservation, and action or advocacy. And so I work in the education department. That's why I get to do fun things like come out and educate you all about the things that like our conservation team, which are not the most like outgoing people, but they're great with the birds. Especially like Laura Zitsky in the center photo here working on the piping plover project. That is one of the probably greatest conservation success stories that we have here in the state of Maine, especially if there's anyone here who's visiting from other New England states. We hear from a lot of people on like Massachusetts beaches, or I think especially Rhode Island, where their approach is shut down the beach. Maine doesn't shut down any beaches and still has the highest productivity of piping plovers nesting in the state than any other region. So it's thanks to the work of our kind of team like that. And then a wonderful kind of success stories. I won't talk about it too much tonight, but our advocacy group also does a wonderful bit of work out there. The thing that I love about working for Maine Audubon, there's a lot of great nonprofits in the state, especially a bunch doing great conservation work. But the thing that always drew me to Maine Audubon is that we always take a science-based approach to everything we do. So we like having data that's going to drive the decisions that we make, which sometimes like can seem a little counterintuitive. Sometimes we say like, oh, we all love, how charismatic that creature is, like, why don't we save it? And sometimes like the data tells us other things. So I won't go into too much of that other than to say, to approach tonight's talk, I wanted to kind of use data so that we can look back of all the data that we have. We can really kind of figure out like what can we predict for the future with this idea of like what's going to happen to these birds that call essentially Monhegan home. This is a horrible species to use for that example for a bird that calls Monhegan home, because dick thistle, for a lot of the birders that come out here in the spring and in the fall, this is a migrant that passes through. For tonight's talk, I really want to focus on who are the birds, again, that are calling Monhegan home. Home being both for nesting in the summer, right now. That's like one of my favorite things about coming out to Monhegan during especially, mid to late June, certainly through July. And now the nesting season is kind of wrapping up, and it's really fun to see like what birds are dependent on this place, and especially the resources that are here. Unlike a dick thistle that is migrating through, but when you have a nice, perfectly blurred background, it makes for a good slide. I'll also focus a bit on birds that are using Monhegan in the winter. I think this is something that we don't think enough about. It's definitely kind of a big change, I'd say, over the decades as you look at conservation, where there was always so much emphasis on where are the birds breeding, like, protect those areas. Where are they wintering? Protect those areas. Now I feel like we've really found this holistic approach of the connectivity between breeding, wintering, and the migration areas. But that's all to say, for tonight, I want to focus on who's here breeding, who's here wintering, and how are those populations kind of changing. So a couple of the data sets I want to use and talk about. Let's see if this video plays. This is a wonderful flock of crossbills from a couple winters ago. So one data set I'm going to use are the Christmas bird counts, especially for any year-round residents that are in the room. You probably see me show up usually the first weekend of January with a team of birders like this. This photo is a few years ago. This was the year that I took over coordinating the Monhegan Christmas bird count from Peter Vickery, who's on the right of the photo there. He had started it back in the 70s. And the idea was to come out every year. The Christmas bird count is the longest running citizen science project. So it's that fun balance that we can look at it and say, like, our goal is to count every bird on this island every winter. And it's easy to kind of look at that and say, like, how are you counting every bird? And, especially when you've got a massive flock like this that are going to be like passing overhead. do you think we actually got an accurate count of those birds? The way I like to think of it is like, as long as we do it wrong every winter, you know, we'll still we'll still identify the trends. Do it wrong the same way. I will acknowledge there have been some gaps. As I talked to Peter when I took it over, he mentions like when one of his sons was born, like there was almost a 10-year gap there in the late 90s where there's no data. So acknowledging some gaps in this. We also have some absolutely wonderful resources in Maine now. This Birds of Maine, authored by Peter Vickery. Then he unfortunately passed away before completing this project. So Charles Duncan, who was actually also in that photo, Bill Sheehan, Jeff Wells, and then it was edited by Scott Weidenstall and his wife Barbara Vickery. And my goodness, just the artwork is a reason enough to pick up a copy of this book. It's not a field guide, is maybe the important thing I'll say. If I can flip the pages a little faster in a second here, or maybe it's not in this clip, but this is the species account. So it goes through kind of our whole history, what we know of Maine birds, kind of through the literature, the older books in the background there. I think it's 1909 or 1908, Orrin Knight's Birds of Maine, and then in 1849 was Ralph Palmer. So I'll reference some of those. You'll hear those dates occasionally like thrown out. They're great kind of snapshots in time where we know like what was going on with Maine's birds. And as Kristen mentioned during my little intro there, I'm also going to reference some data from the Maine Bird Atlas. So this was a citizen science project run by the state, by Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Over the last 5 years, we covered the entire state. I'll show you a map in a second. Actually, I'll let this loop through. Here is after 2 years of effort. So the whole state, we broke up into these blocks. Each block is 9 square miles. And we wanted about 40 hours of effort in every block. 4,080 blocks in the entire state. You can do the math real quick. There's no way we're gonna get all that covered. So we wanted a systematic distribution of the state. And here's what it looks like. If you asked me at the end of 2 years, if we were gonna get this done, even at the end of 3 years and maybe even 4 years, this was a remarkable effort. And we now have some of the it is the best data we've ever had of birds and their distribution across the entire state. So, you know, I'm gonna take this one little block down here and share some of the insights from it. Monhegan actually, because of how it was actually covered 2 different blocks, but not important. The amazing thing is that we got this done. To think about the amount of effort it took to especially get into that northwestern part of the state was really amazing. The really fun thing is being able to look at the first time this was done in Maine. So from 1978 to 83 was the first atlasing effort done in Maine. And being able to compare kind of that snapshot to the snapshot we just took over the last 5 years and see how have birds changed. So I'll have a few slides, especially when we're talking about some of the range changes of different species. I'll show you a map that is basically a scan out of this book. Not very high tech back in the 80s when everyone just emailed in index cards of what birds, or excuse me, did I say that right? Mailed. They didn't email. A stamp was needed, apparently. Have you guys heard of these things? Someone told me about these. You like licked the back of them. So you'll see, I'll show you a couple comparison maps from this first atlas to the second atlas. So what I spend most of my time doing, especially this summer, is now starting to write the species accounts. We're doing all the QA/QC, going through the data, cleaning it up. We'll take the next year to write it, and then hopefully in about a year, 18 months, maybe I'll be standing here again with a book and I'll say, hey everyone, remember that? If I still have my sanity. So to get us kind of back on course, that is the data I want to pull from. So everything I'm, going to present tonight, those are kind of the sources. Obviously, some of it, like the bird atlas, we're still. I will say those are preliminary results. And what putting this talk together, it won't be the most linear talk, I'll say, because the interesting thing with birds is that there are good examples for a lot of these things, as we're going to talk about the birds of Monhegan, the man-made kind of causes in ways that like some of them got here or how we've affected them. And that's really not too different from like some of the ways that we are changing the climate and causing those birds to come here, which is like essentially leading into range shifts. So I'll put this out here. Maybe the only thing that will kind of follow this outline is to say, well, the last couple slides on with some take homes, things that you can do to, hopefully help the birds that are around you. But we'll kind of bounce through some of these things. But this is the things that I wanted to talk about. Next birds, I'm thinking of like, what are the next birds I expect to show up on Monhegan? Now, perhaps not the first thing you would think I would talk about. I think mallard is such an interesting species for us to think about here in the state of Maine, here on Monhegan. It is like the most common nesting duck, at least if you were to go into the meadow to find any fresh water, go down to the ice pond. Like mallard is the duck that is here breeding. American black ducks, occasional, you'll see one or two mixed in. But if you go back, especially kind of early 1900s, there were no mallards here. This is a species that was considered a rare migrant that would pass through the state. It wasn't until May of 1940, the state, I think it was Inland Fisheries and Wildlife or whatever they called themselves at the time, raised 200 mallards at a game farm and released them up near Bangor. The town was Eddington, still Penobscot County. That was May of 1940. 9 years later was the first time a mallard was found actually nesting in the state. They have now spread, and they are the most abundant duck statewide. They're displacing our black ducks. They're hybridizing with our black ducks. And it's kind of an amazing one to look at, how well established they are out here as well. And to think like that was humans. This was one of those anthropogenic means of bringing these birds up here. What a great success. An interesting one, if you've found yourself in the last 2 years kind of out, especially back by the pump house where the meadow stays a little more open, you can see this is the female blue-winged teal. The males have this little kind of white crescent that comes down the front of the face. I don't know actually how they're doing this this summer, but last year was the first time that they were confirmed nesting on Monhegan, which is actually quite an outlier if you were to look at kind of the distribution of blue-winged teals nesting in Maine. Most of them there's a couple marshes, but especially once you get them into like northern, especially like Aroostook County, some near Penobscot County, but it's a really cool one to see that, like, amongst all of these introduced mallards that are around here, some of our other native species are being successful. Again, a really cool one. On this idea of birds that aren't here essentially on their own, as the name implies, European starling is a non-native species that was introduced in the US. It's one of the few non-natives that seems to have really like established itself on Monhegan. You can hear some chuckles. I'm sure folks have encountered these. It's an interesting one. They are nesting out here as well. This poor little grub, you get those little arms just trying. I mean, maybe they're helping get some grubs out of your yard, but the neat thing about European starlings, one of the reasons that we think of them as they're non-native, but they're also invasive. And one of the big problems with them is they are what we call secondary cavity nesters. So secondary, they don't make cavities of their own, they're going to move into, whether it's an old hole made by a woodpecker. You can think of most of our woodpeckers are the primary cavity nesters. They're going to find a big dead tree, excavate a cavity in it, nest in there 1 year, and then woodpeckers each year generally are going to find a new tree, build a new cavity, but now that perfect nesting site is going to be left over. An interesting thing as we start thinking about other cavity nesters, there's over the course of the atlas, we did confirm tree swallows nesting on the island, but there are very few cavities on this island. There's very few hardwoods. It's kind of an interesting way to think about it, which is generally what a lot of the woodpeckers and then obviously these secondary cavity nesters are going to be using. You don't want sap just oozing from your cavity all summer long. So it's interesting to me that our European starlings are thriving so much out here, and it's fun to look at like what they're actually using, because they go, maybe this is why we heard some chuckles, they go into the sides of buildings. They are finding some of the most creative cavities that you could find on this island. One that just doesn't seem to get itself established, the house sparrow. Some folks might know this by the colloquial name, the English sparrow. House sparrows, apparently their origin story is that they were brought over to help the transition for when there were a lot of European immigrants coming to the States. They said, why don't we help ease that transition by showing them some wildlife that they might be familiar with from home. So if you look at the kind of history of introductions of house sparrows in the New World, it makes sense. New York City, where a lot of immigrants were coming into, got the first introduction of house sparrows, and then Portland, Maine was actually the second place in the New World in the U.S. to have house sparrows introduced. So I always like to, give us a little credit. We've got one of the oldest lineages of house sparrows, which I don't know if that's anything to brag about, but this is one of the only ones I've seen on Monhegan, sitting on kind of perfect Monhegan habitat. But they just don't seem to get too well established out here. Maybe it has something to do with the number of raptors that we see migrating through in the fall. Really don't seem to do quite as well. This is another secondary cavity nester, but they tend to be more restricted to, if this photo extended a little bit more, you would see the birdhouse right under it. They're not as kind of generalist as the European starlings are, but it's an interesting one. It's probably a good thing up there, not out here, because they would be out competing a lot of those native species that we're otherwise trying to support. Why I wanted to mention that little bit about some of the non-native, those invasive species that we do see out here was, folks might remember this came out late 2019. I feel like it was finally kind of gaining a lot of traction as we went into 2020, and then people got distracted by a lot of other things in 2020. So I want to cycle back to it. I'll encourage folks to check out this website, 3billionbirds.org. It's where you can find this report that came out, and it was one of the most comprehensive studies done, largely looking at things like the Christmas bird count, which we already mentioned, also breeding bird surveys, routes that are covered kind of across the country, and basically, much like what I'm trying to digest for us to think about Monhegan, they did kind of looking at the US and showed some of these really dramatic population declines. So of the breeding population of birds that are out there, this idea that 2.9 billion birds since 1970 are kind of gone from that, which to put it in context, I think this is a little more helpful to think of it as like 1 in 4 of those what we'll just call birds in the breeding population. Keep those numbers in mind, and why I'm emphasizing it is that kind of what's often like identified as like the breeding population, the ones that are out there, because we'll talk about some of the other causes of bird mortalities towards the end. But anyways, this is scary. I won't do a whole talk about that report. You can go read it yourselves, 3billionbirds.org. One of the scary takeaways from me. Well, let's start with something happy. The report did show that for families like the waterfowl, ducks, geese, swans are doing great. It helps when you like overhunt them and kind of wipe out their populations, and then you start doing a lot of conservation work. And waterfowl has really benefited from purchasing land, especially from funds from duck stamps. Guess what? Hunters love it when there's a lot of ducks around. So there's been a ton of effort to go into helping our ducks, geese, and swans. And they're one of the few groups that has actually seen a population increase since the 70s. Some of the other ones were things like raptors. I'll talk about them in a little bit. But then for a lot of the birds, water birds, land birds, shorebirds, starting to see these population declines anywhere between, this is just under 20%. And they included this category of the introduced species. This was one of the like most alarming things, as alarming as it is to look at this report and say like, we've lost 1 in 4 birds in the US since the 70s, like that's a scary number. But even the non-native invasive species that like should be thriving, they're out competing the native species, even they're suffering. They're seeing some of the larger declines. Like that is terrifying. I think a good kind of context to keep in mind. I won't focus on that tonight, but it's when we think about, whatever the expression is, these birds are literally the canaries in the coal mine telling us what's going on in the environment around us. If even the they're practically canaries here in Maine, they're non-native. If even they're suffering, it's telling us that something like insect populations are declining, which, yeah, we know they are. Anyways, let's look at some other birds that we see here on Monhegan. Sorry, some of these colors are a little hot. Trust me, that was a bright cardinal when I photographed it, but it's looking especially good on the screen right now. The fun one that I like to think about with northern cardinal, especially for most folks in Maine, we get to kind of take them for granted right now. If you were to flip back at some of those resources I was showing before, like the 1949 book from Ralph Palmer, Birds of Maine, or Maine Birds, he talks about northern cardinals in Maine. There were only a couple records in 1949, and he said that they were more likely to be escaped pets than vagrant birds, or birds actually expanding their range up here. That was the mindset in 1949, because we did have Migratory Bird Treaty Act by then, but at least there were certainly still people out there with anyways, a beautiful songster, bright red bird. Like these birds were definitely held in cages. It would only take another 20 years. 1969 was the first time that northern cardinals were found breeding here in the state. And they have gone through this rapid range expansion since then. Here's my best attempt at some data for Monhegan. This is just looking at Christmas bird count data. So again, our small teams of birders coming out for a couple days, usually in the first week of January. I'll show you another chart with another measure. This is just going to show you raw numbers, because I think it's easy for us as a collective group to look at this and say, oh, 5 cardinals, 10 cardinals, 15, 20, like you can envision 20 cardinals. A better measure to use is something like birds per party hour, where you're dividing that number by the amount of effort that went into it, because like, I don't remember 2019 or maybe that was January 2020. We were out. If it was super cold and windy, like it might have just been really hard to detect them. And we probably, maybe we only spent a few hours, and that's why it's down. So level this out. I, again, am going to use this. I'll show you, I think I have 1 or 2 examples where I do put in birds per party hour. The thing is, the trend is the same, whether I show you either one, but I think we as a group will understand if I just give you the number of birds a little bit better. Anyways, the number of northern cardinals on Monhegan has been increasing every year since we started doing the Christmas bird counts out here. So when we think about the future of Monhegan's birds, this is one that I don't see this slowing down. It's also a fun one. When you look at statewide, it was, again, around the 60s was the first time northern cardinals were found in Maine. Some of those Christmas counts had like just 1 or 2, then it quickly went to 4, 10. I think last year it was like 1,600 northern cardinals were reported across the state. So they're doing great. Yeah. Another kind of interesting one to think about. As we said, these guys are doing really well. Mourning doves are doing great. Not that long ago, looking at some of our resources, it says in the 19th century, they were considered a rare species in Maine. It was by the 1920s that they hit York and Cumberland counties and have just kind of continued to spread. The first time one had actually spent a winter in Maine, thanks to that Warren Knight book, was 1910 down in Pownell. And they have just started to spread, and it's kind of, again, fun to see at least, whatever trend line we can draw on that very Christmas count numbers. This is a bird that's spreading up here. 1949, that Palmer book was the first time that they were considered common in mid-coast. It's a fun one. Maine's a pretty large state, and this is one of my favorite things about, like, especially when we were doing the bird atlas, some of the conversations that we were having in southern Maine, especially like the earliest Canada geese nesting in like late March, maybe early April, we'd find a Canada goose sitting on a nest. I'd call Bill Sheehan up in Aroostook County, and he still had 8 feet of snow in his backyard. No geese anywhere. So he's always a fun one to talk to. Here's Bill Sheehan's photo. The mourning doves that he has up in Aroostook County really struggle throughout the winters. And little bird toes where they have no, feathers for insulation or anything. And we actually saw this, we were up there this past winter. If you go on, which one is it? Explore.org. There's a feeder cam set up in northern Maine where you can see evening grosbeaks and things coming into a bird feeder. It's Bill's yard. And you can look at his mourning doves, which are not built for those really cold winters. And they actually get frostbite on their toes and they essentially start falling off throughout the winter, which, that's rough. Sorry for that image, but and this was the image that Bill Sheehan put up on his his eBird report where he was like submitting this. So I love that he added that in, all toes missing, which is as if the image wasn't enough for us. So some other species that are changing their range. The maps that we'll have on the next few slides, I believe, these are some of our results from this current breeding bird atlas. So over the last 5 years, remember this was our 9 square mile blocks. And within each block, we were basically trying to get our volunteers to say, were the birds just observed? They were only seen there. If they were doing something well, red-bellied woodpecker is a bad example, but if they were singing or if they were inappropriate habitat for nesting, we would consider that a possible record. Once they're doing something like you see a pair of them or they're maintaining a territory, that bumps it up to a probable. And then once you find like a nest or see an adult carrying food to feed the chick, that's where you get a confirmed record. So this is the distribution that we have now. During that first atlas in Maine, 1978 to 83, there were no red-bellied woodpeckers in the state. So pretty remarkable in what a short time frame these birds have kind of gone through this really dramatic range expansion. Does everyone here believe in climate change? There's a great paper that came out actually a few years ago now, that shows how red-bellied woodpeckers range expansion is a result of climate change. And the researchers looked at what's called Bergmann's rule, the distribution of these birds. Basically, the further you get the further away you get from the equator, the more mass the species has to have in order to survive. So they have this great distribution of, you know, these smaller, skinny little red-bellied woodpeckers down in Florida. In the 1950s, they only made it up to New Jersey, and they were much larger and heftier up there. Now, if you look at their distribution now, the ones that we have up here are the larger, heftier ones, because you have to be a little larger and hefty if you're going to survive Maine's winter. Anyways, that pattern changed, and that Bergmann's rule kind of held true. So if you were to go to someplace like New Jersey, where the birds that were there in 1950 had less mass than they do now, the only way you can have the same species occurring in the same area now with less mass is the climate's gotten warmer there. Like, I'm sure after the last couple of weeks, I don't have to convince anyone that the climate is changing. Maybe I guess we have to focus that it's more man-caused. But anyways, this is an interesting species, as you might have been able to see with our little Monhegan dot. Not confirmed breeding out here yet. It is fairly common, especially in the fall, when we apparently see a little post-breeding dispersal of them coming out here. So not nesting, low numbers, very few winter records actually, but this is a species that, you know, if this is the distribution change that we've seen in just the last few decades, they're going to become more and more common out here. Speaking of becoming common out here, Carolina wren, a wonderful bird, one of the loudest songsters out here. You can hear them singing year round. Interestingly, we only got up to a probable record for them with the bird atlas, which, like, as far as we're concerned, is like just as good as confirmed. We know they're out here in decent numbers. What I like looking at with some of these species, and here's a quick number of, this is for the entire state, and I actually included the birds per party hour. You can see the two lines are nearly identical. How they've gone through kind of this big increase in Maine. A fascinating thing with Carolina wrens, and it's fun to think about with a lot of these species, that we are on the northern edge of their range. As they're expanding northward, these are the ones that, much like the mourning doves with their frozen little toes, are going to, you know, have some harsh conditions, to see if they can get through. And that's what we actually see with some of these big drops occasionally. Carolina wrens seem to do okay when there's really cold temperatures, but it's when we have really deep snow. And somewhere I'll find some data set with like snow depths in Maine. But what tends to always happen, 2011, 2015, those are some of the years that we get like back to back nor'easters. You get the 3-foot storm, the 4-foot storm, and all of a sudden, for a lot of the food that these Carolina wrens are looking for, you'll occasionally see them coming to your feeders, especially going to suet. But apparently, the main thing that they're looking for in winter are especially biters, little arachnids that are, you know, underneath bark. They can be remarkably active in really cold temperatures. But when you get so much snow that it like buries all of that food, that's when Carolina wrens really get knocked back. So it's interesting. You can see the trend here, but we get these years where they really disappear. And so, not great data, but you can almost see kind of the correlation. So this red line is showing us the number of Carolina wrens during the Monhegan Christmas bird count. That blue line was the number from all of Maine's Christmas bird counts. And what I think is so interesting is you can see some of these, the same years that there was this like dramatic jump up. So like 2012, whatever kind of range expand, like whether they had big breeding success and a lot of them all pushed north that year, we see that both statewide and out here on some of the islands, which is interesting to think like where these birds are coming from. There's clearly some like refresh of birds that are coming out here. It's not just a stable population. Tufted titmouse. So here's one of the maps from that first atlas. Maybe a thing worth mentioning, they, because there are not as many people, harder to collect data, they used topo quads. So those are actually 6 times larger than the blocks that we used in our first atlas. But at least from a comparison standpoint. And what we're looking at are all the blocks that have these little black circles in them are where they were confirmed breeding. These half-filled circles are the probable, and then the little circles are possible. So only a dozen or so blocks across the whole state that had titmice even present in them during the first atlas, versus now look at this kind of amazing, again, species that is just spreading its way up here. A fun one to mention for Monhegan, because not even observed out here. This is one of the species that is just not here yet. Our tufted titmouse. I had to look up this word. Thalassophobia. Maybe if there's anyone on Zoom, maybe you're all suffering from thalassophobia. It's the fear of crossing seas. So I'm glad you could still attend tonight. But anyways. There's a few species like tufted titmouse, I guess. So thalassa is Greek for sea, and then of course phobia or phobos, fear. There's a few species that are, as soon as you hit the mainland, they are super abundant. Tufted titmouse being one of them. Another great one is pileated woodpecker. They just do not like crossing water and are very rare species out here. I don't know of any actual confirmed tufted titmouse records on this island. And it's always funny to me, the number of birders that come out here and we're looking for rare things from the West or, these vagrants that show up. It's like, I would flip out if I saw a titmouse out here. Or pileated. Pileated is actually slowly moving out into some of the islands. So I know out on Allen Island, they were found nesting a couple years ago. Last summer, I got to do some surveys on Matinicus and had one pileated flying around out there. And I was just like, go to Monhegan. They're strong flyers. You'd think they could make it. Just to talk about a few other species that are out here that are seeing some kind of more dramatic changes in their population. This was from one of our Christmas bird counts. That's me way out on the rocks, being as safe as possible. To zoom in a little bit, this is what I was doing. There's a couple species of cormorants that you can see on the island. We have double-crested cormorants, which are nesting out on Niduk. We see them by the hundreds, well, thousands this time of year. There are also great cormorants. That is the endangered species that's nesting here in the state. What I was doing at the time, there were no audio recordings, at least in the Macaulay Library, which is Cornell's big database of photo, video, and audio. They didn't have any audio recordings of great cormorants in the United States. So what else was I to do? Then climb down there. And so this is a species that they're nesting on just a couple islands left in the Gulf of Maine that they're still nesting on. And while they're not nesting here on Monhegan, sorry, I thought I had their map. There are a lot that winter here. They come especially on those cliffs on the east side. We were climbing down there in the evening because they'll come in and roost on those cliffs as the sun's going down. That's why this is such a grainy photo. But they sound like seals, which is one of the funny things to get this recording. It's like I should have just gone and recorded the harbor seals. It would have been a lot easier. Anyways, you can see the trend where on some of these older Christmas counts, especially the first one, I'm really curious about the number. It was over 100 great cormorants they had, and you can see over the years it's really steadily declined. now, we're lucky to crack into the double digits. So there's the map. Again, it's a species that, there's kind of a long history of, issues with everything from fishermen. If you're out catching fish, not catching much, and you look over and you see how successful these guys are, people tend not to like them. It's an interesting one to me, where the next species I'll talk about is a very large, charismatic national bird, which gets lots of love and attention. And when you compare it to something like this, which I would argue is, in a lot of trouble, actually here in the state, it's just a few islands around Isle of Ho and then out on Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge, where that population is actually, it's remarkable how well they're doing out there. But it also helps when you have an island that actually has researchers stationed on it that are helping those birds, because otherwise, I'm sure folks have looked out on Niduk and you've seen the double-crested cormorant nests. They're just those thick nests sitting out on that bare exposed rock. If you are a bald eagle and you see a nest like that, that looks like a platter. And why would you settle for, the medium size, the 6-ounce sirloin, when you can get the 10-ounce sirloin of the great, the great cormorant? So bald eagles are one of the biggest problems for species like great cormorants, where our bald eagle population is just it's one of one of the greatest conservation success stories. Our national bird really brought back from the brink. Didn't know there'd be so many tongue twisters in this, but there's that kind of long story I'll say that I'll skip. But I hope everyone's well aware of, back when those organochlorides like DDT were being used, that through bioaccumulation would especially build up in a lot of raptors, causing thinning of eggshells. That's why things like eagles were kind of wiped out. Eagles, ospreys, peregrine falcons, to oversimplify, it's fun to look at this, even by 1978, 83, the end of our first atlas, they were getting well established in kind of the Down East region, but amazing to see. This was a species, we were just under 40 nests at the low point in Maine. And now in 2018 was the last time the state did aerial surveys, where they actually flew around to all known nests. You can tell if a nest is active or not, because if you do it at the right time of year, if the eagle is sitting on the nest, it's active. The eagle is sitting near the nest, it's not active. I love how simple some of these surveys can be. 733 active nests in 2018, wow. And that's what this map on the right really does a great job showing. Because we're already closing in on 8:30, I won't belabor this point, but I have to make the quick plug. We're coming up on 50 years of the Endangered Species Act, helping to save species that are literally on the brink of going extinct. It works. Here's a great example of it. It wasn't that long ago. I won't make any really political statements up here. Just a few years ago, the Endangered Species Act, we weren't really, yes, there were certain people that would have loved to have gotten rid of it, but even just the reinterpretation of it was some of the scariest things to look at. And the idea that, what do they call it? That you could conduct an economic analysis of what it would take to protect a species, and that would be the decision of like if it should be protected or not. If anyone drove through Wiscasset to get here, does anyone remember, was that like 2010 or so, when they were redoing the bridge, and it was going to have like this nice new way that it would cut through town, cut across, and it would alleviate all of our problems with traffic? And then they found the bald eagles that were nesting on that point of land right where the bridge was going to go. And it derailed the whole thing. It's like a $150 million project that got derailed because of one nesting bald eagle. It's a fascinating story. Go look it up. Anyways, that's why we still have a ton of traffic, those darn eagles. But they're still there, which is awesome. Just to mention a couple more, I'll do these a little quickly because I've been rambling. Merlin is one of the most interesting things. This is our medium-sized falcon. We have the small American kestrel, medium-sized Merlin, and a large peregrine falcon, make up the 3 falcons that we have in the state of Maine. Merlin, during the first atlas, none. We didn't have a single Merlin nesting in the state. This is one of the few species that is actually like expanding its range southward, kind of coming down from the boreal forest, while almost everything else we're seeing expand northward. It's an interesting one to look at, where some of the older literature talks about Merlins being seen like in the summer in Maine, but there's actually some question of like if those were just actually misidentified kestrels. Anyways, it's a fascinating one. This is one of the species that has probably had the greatest population gain in the state. And guess what? Yeah, we confirmed them nesting out in Cathedral Woods last summer. Just mention a few more. These are birds that maybe not nesting on Monhegan, but certainly on some of these islands. We can see right offshore, common eiders. I've seen huge population declines. It's an interesting one to look at some of our Christmas bird count data, because there are some massive flocks observed some winters. Now it's rare for us to see really what I would call flocks at all. One of the things that's often cited with the common eider declines is with ocean acidification. The primary food source for eiders is blue mussels, and mussel populations are just tanked. So the beds are gone. So they're definitely struggling there. Last year, they were also hit really hard. This was, I was out last July, and with avian influenza that was showing up and spreading across a lot of islands. Just that was 4th of July weekend, we were out and there were a couple eiders that we encountered just on the beaches around here. And this was true kind of around the state. One of the scarier ones were another species really hard hit by avian influenza in the state were great blackback gulls. Really? Yeah, so Maine Audubon, some of the properties we have include Wood Island down, if you go to, Biddeford Pool, you look off, there's Wood Island with a lighthouse on it. Except for what the Coast Guard owns, we maintain the rest of that island, which has hundreds of great blackback gulls nesting on it, and almost that entire colony was wiped out last year. I was actually kind of thrilled as we were taking the boat in today, looking out on Niduk. There were a bunch of these like great blackback chicks. They're getting quite large now, but they were looking good out there. Anyways, for the sake of time, let's go a little faster. Some of the species that I'm kind of curious to keep an eye on and see what's going to happen to them kind of in the future. Especially if you get up into Cathedral Woods. This is not a species you're too likely to encounter in town, unless it's probably a migrant passing through. But Swainson's thrush, this is one of our Cathras thrushes. They have just amazing otherworldly songs. That's your homework assignment. Go look up what these birds sound like. You've probably encountered them walking around the northern half of the island. We did have them confirmed nesting out here, which is kind of an interesting thing when you look at the rest of the state. All these other lighter pink dots are where they were just observed. So this is a species that we are on the southern end of their range. It's going to be really interesting to see through some bit of climate change, of habitat changes, especially if we see anything like spruces kind of retreating out of here. Like, what are some of these species that really depend on those forests? What are they going to look like? We'll be, this is the kind of thing we'll be able to watch over the, years to come. But when we think about, ideally, we would do an atlas every like 20 years in Maine. We're way overdue compared to that one in the 80s. But I'm very curious to see like what's going to change by the time we do our next atlas. Oh boy. So everyone's sitting down. Black-capped chickadee, the state bird, maybe. They're doing fine. I hate these talks where it's like everything's good, everything's bad. So there's a lot of species we didn't talk about. Things like chickadees, they're doing great. To wrap up here, I know we're 8:30. I will hang out for questions, but a few kind of take-home messages, things I want you to think about, ways that we can help these birds, kind of on a variety of ways. If you consume coffee, I drink as much coffee as I can on any given day. Thinking about the coffee that you are consuming is actually a great thing you can do, especially like as a consumer. One of the most important, important changes that you can make is buying shade grown, what we call shade grown coffee. It's kind of a funny term because guess what? All coffee has to grow in the shade. That's like how the plant grows. But the fact that it's grown in, in the habitat, especially with native plants, that's what this Smithsonian bird-friendly certification is going to get it. If folks are aware of Doug Talmay, especially his book Bringing Nature Home, where he talks about the importance of having native plants on the landscape, providing that bottom of the food chain that's going to feed kind of the next generation of birds. That's kind of one of the ideas of this Smithsonian certification, is that coffee, which is, not a native plant where most of us are getting our coffee from, but making sure that it's still being grown in an area that's essentially going to benefit birds. Because otherwise you can clear an area, plant all the coffee you want, put up artificial shade and grow it super fast. It'll taste more bitter, but we drink a lot of it anyway. So buy shade grown coffee. That's one of the best ways to help birds like magnolia warbler, another species we have nesting on the northern half of the island. And when you look at their distribution, this is some of the spatial temporal exploratory modeling that eBird's able to do with all of our submissions. You get to see these amazing maps week by week. So we're scrolling throughout the year. This is relative abundance, and fun to see what a mad dash it is in the spring to get on your breeding grounds. And here they come in their fall migration. Yeah. And when you think about like where a lot of our coffee is coming from, again, as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, think about this connectivity between breeding grounds, wintering grounds, and of course, helping those birds in migration is also important. But quite often we don't think about, that magnolia warbler that entertains us all summer long as we hear it sing. Maybe we catch glimpses of it. Help it out when it's spending the winter down in Guatemala by buying shade-grown coffee. Kind of tease this a bit with that mention about Doug Talmay, this need for native plants on the landscape. We all love planting, rugosa rose. We want to look like we live on Martha's Vineyard, don't we? Guess what? It's a non-native plant that's not helping any insects. You do see the bees rolling in it. That's cute. Getting more native plants on the landscape is, again, that bottom of the food chain best way to be helping help those insects, and that's the food that's going to give us the next generation of birds. And obviously, avoiding the use of pesticides is also going to help. When we're, as we mentioned, with like even the invasive species are seeing those population declines, it's probably because the food web's pretty screwed up. One of the most heartbreaking photos I've taken on Monhegan is this monarch laying eggs on black swallowwort. It's in that same family. It's in the milkweed family. So from a monarch's perspective, it thinks it can lay eggs on this, but it's not the common swamp or what's it called, butterfly milkweed that they need. So this will be a toxic plant. This is a non-native plant. We got to get rid of some of this, which is a great plug. If you're not going to be planting those natives or not using pesticides, support the organizations that are going to be doing that work. So, Monhegan Associates, renew your memberships if you don't have them already, or get out there and help with some of the trail work and other things. Last couple slides. So we've talked about population declines in birds. And when we think about the causes of these, the biggest thing that we have to acknowledge is, of all the causes out there, cats are by far the biggest cause of anthropomorphic or anthropomorphic cause of bird mortalities in the US alone. You can look up this report. There's actually a wonderful supplement that went with it that basically backs up all these numbers. So when people talk about all the other things that are causing mortalities in birds, to think that cats, a non-native creature, that we have, they do a great job keeping mice away, which is why when we started cultivating food in the Fertile Crescent, we said, wow, we like cats, they help us. Let's start trading these goods all across the globe and bring these cats with us so that they keep the pests out of our food. Humans have just spread cats all over the globe. Let me just say, I'm a cat lover. I have 3 cats at home, all named after female Supreme Court justices, if that tells you anything. But they're going to live long, happy, healthy lives, and so are the birds by those cats being a nearly domesticated animal that humans have spread across the globe. It's our duty to keep them inside, especially when you're on an island where like super tired migrants are just like landing at your feet. This was look at this young guy. That's me. 2011, I think. Pointing at, this is bay-breasted warbler, black-throated green warbler, yellow warbler. There's a black and white somewhere behind us. These poor, tired little birds that we literally started taking shifts, watching the birds down at the beach, helping keep cats away. The last plug I want to make, because I've talked about things like the Christmas bird count, like breeding bird surveys, we've looked at a lot of eBird data from the Maine Bird Atlas, to encourage you all to figure out how you can become whatever the term is you like, citizen scientists, community scientists. I really like the word contributory scientists, these projects that you can contribute to yourself, because all those things actually mean different things. eBird, I'm going to really make the plug because we've spent the last hour talking about birds. That is one of the best ways, especially because it focuses on the idea of like, what are all the birds around you, wanting to know effort, which tells us things like frequency and abundance. It's really good. If you've been sitting here for the last hour saying like, wow, I hate birds even more than I did, there we go. There's other projects for you. iNaturalist, you can upload you can upload sightings of any living thing in the world, and you can get involved. And especially on a place like Monhegan, why I want to make this plug. Sorry for the white slides. When I looked at eBird data, this is just the number of checklists submitted to eBird from Monhegan. This is the distribution we get. We're really good at knowing like during spring migration, when there's lots of birders out here. Then fall migration tends to be a little bit more drawn out. That's great. The fun thing, I decided to change the scale a little bit. If we go logarithmic with it, this is orders of magnitude more information. So like when if you're out here in March, good on you. That's great. But count like the 5 birds that are out here with you. Submit that to eBird. I think I've shown you with what little data we have. We know we have like this little, wait for it, glimpse of what's going on with Monhegan's birds. And I think we live in this this modern information age where especially the phones that are probably in most of your pockets are such a great tool for being able to record the birds you hear singing around you. If you see them, it literally takes seconds to submit a record like that to eBird, to iNaturalist, and getting that information someplace that it can be used by people like myself or other researchers, maybe with questions we don't even know to ask yet. I think if you value the birds that are around here, the one thing that you can do to kind of give back to them is contribute to something like a contributory science project. So with that, thank you all so much. I definitely want to thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Questions?
I can't be the only one hot in here. So I'll also say, I'm happy to hang on for questions, but I will not be insulted at all if people need to go breathe.
So I just want to say one thing before we get to questions, in case people are going to leave during the questions. Just to remind everybody, the last talk in our Ecology Talk series is on August 13th, not a Thursday, it's a Sunday. But same time and place. It's Matt Rose and Daniel Bates are going to talk about the past, present, and future of Monhegan's water supply. So hope you can join us for that last one as well. Questions?
Thank you very much. Questions?
And I'll also look at the chat in case anyone's.
I did look at the
Okay.
chat. I didn't-
Great. Stand.
You covered it.
Yeah.
Try if you haven't said anything about the pheasant.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. One of them heard you. Yeah, I mean, what an interesting, are we supposed to know how they got reintroduced back out here, or is that still lore? So I mean, it was such an interesting thing, especially when you look at like the counts. So pheasants were introduced on a lot of the offshore islands in Maine for hunting. It's a similar story with a lot of the snowshoe hares you see on islands. Like, what a great weekend activity to go out to an island and harvest. Some of the more populated islands where the pheasants have persisted. The story I've heard, and this is where I'll say, like, I don't know much about pheasants. All the females were wiped out. This was, within the last decade. There were just a few males kind of hanging on. Now there's a whole bunch more. I don't know how they got out here. Maybe someone. Yeah. Oh, there are. So now, you reinsert a few more females into a population.
And boy, you got pheasants.
Yeah. And, it's an interesting one to think about from like, what is the impact that they're having here? I would be thinking about Maine, the things that they might be competing with on the mainland would be other gallinaceous birds, things like wild turkeys, ruffed grouse, which we don't have out here. So I want like, I'll bet it was a pheasant chick. Young, young. The female pheasants or young ones where the tails aren't thrown in.
I'll bet-
Yeah.
I'll bet on it.
Yeah.
Well, there used to be way back. Takeo had a pheasant, and he was a painter out here, lived in Lobster Cove. And Takeo had a pheasant, and the pheasant's friend was a rabbit, a white rabbit, yes. And you'd see them in the woods together. But he disappeared, and that did not start the current run.
Probably 6 years or 6 or so years ago, up by the old ball field, there was a wild turkey carcass. And I've always wondered about that because I was talking to some folks on, where was it? We were talking on Hog Island. I was helping with one of the teams camps this summer. Gosh, I gotta track this down. Someone saw, they said, they were on like one of the boat trips and saw this turkey just like open water, just going out. And I've always wondered about that turkey carcass. Like, was that like one of the first naturally occurring turkeys? It was around, it was for the Christmas bird count we were out here. So maybe, Thanksgiving dinner went wrong. I have some feathers from it somewhere, so we could do like a what is it, stable isotope analysis, figure out like what was it eating. Anyways, there's someday maybe turkeys will be out here.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you all.
And if you guys want to just pitch in, hold up
I'm
your
scared.
Yeah.
I'll go to that.